Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for that warm introduction, Senya. I'm mostly going to be talking about the exhibition, which of course is what I'm most knowledgeable about. I'm curious if any of you have seen the show already. Okay, just good to have a sense. I see a colleague there who maybe has seen the show more than once. So I hope for those of you who haven't yet seen it, you'll make your way a few blocks down to see the exhibition, which is on view until mid-August. So let me dig in. And this exhibition is the first exhibition on Georgia O'Keeffe that we have had at the Museum of Modern Art in 77 years. The first and last exhibition the museum devoted to the artist was in 1946. And so it has been quite some time. That was a show that included 57 works, but only 3 works on paper. And this current show has about 130 works by the artist that spans her breakthrough 2-year period of 1915 to 1917, all the way through her work in the 1950s and 60s. She lived till the age of 98. She died in 1986. So we can maybe in the Q&A get into some of those interesting questions about why it has been so long since the Museum of Modern Art has given this particular artist a retrospective, or an exhibition, a monographic exhibition. It's an interesting topic. But maybe so this is the beautiful title wall that our in-house graphics department designed for the exhibition, but maybe we'll enter the exhibition virtually. I've tried to intersperse close-up images of some of the works in the show with some of the installation views, just so you can have a sense of where we're oriented. But right when you enter the exhibition, you see 2 series on paper that are juxtaposed. On the right side of the slide, you see a series of 3 works from 1916 that are in charcoal, black watercolor, and blue watercolor, and we'll talk about how materials are incredibly important to this artist. And on the left, you'll see an octet of 8 watercolors. And so right from the beginning, we can get a sense that this is an exhibition not only devoted to the artist's works on paper and her practice on paper, but in particular, her practice of making works in series, which is something that she really did in her practice on paper. She did in some paintings as well, and we'll talk about why. In my research for the exhibition, one of the questions that I sought to answer was why did she make her work on paper in this way? And what I sort of came up with was the idea that each series has a little bit of its own logic, and that different engines or logics or energies really drive different series along the way. And so we can talk about what was driving some of those series. So while the exhibition begins with this really radical work from 1916, 1917, I thought it was important for this crowd to just look back momentarily at the works that Senya just mentioned were on view downstairs. One by O'Keeffe on the right. This is the painting, Rabbit with Copper Pot, that she won an award for in her class with William Merritt Chase at the League. And on the left is the portrait of her made by her colleague Eugene Spiker. And according to her biography, Spiker taunted her at the time when he was making her portrait. "I'm going to be a great painter, and you will probably end up teaching painting in some girls' school." So I think we know who had the last laugh there. But I want to just pause on this slide for a second and to keep it in our minds, because I think that this dichotomy, the idea of what it meant to be a woman artist in 1907, 1908, well, I'm sorry, I should say O'Keeffe was born in Wisconsin to a farm family, 7 children. She moves to Virginia when she's a teenager with her family, and then she begins her studies at the League. She'll also study at Teachers College, Columbia, which we'll talk about a bit, and she studied at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. She studied at the University of Virginia, so she had a lot of academic training. But at this moment in 1907-08, this is very much O'Keeffe before O'Keeffe. And I think that this dichotomy that we see here, whether this young woman who was very striking looking was going to be a model or going to be an artist, was very much a kind of a choice, right? Was she going to accept the attentions of her classmates who wanted to paint her, or was she going to make her own painting and win her own awards and make her own way to Lake George? So we'll see some works that are self-portraits a bit later, and so I just want to keep this moment in mind where maybe the two paths are laying themselves out before us. So how do we get from here to here? It's a pretty radical jump, right? So of course, all of that training that she gained at the League, she takes in, and then she says in 1915, she's a teacher then at the Columbia College in South Carolina, and I should point out too, from a family of not terribly great means and from a large family, for a young woman who was very sure she wanted to be an artist from a young age, she was not able to just go off and be a painter. She had to work. And what it meant for a woman artist at that time to work was to be an art teacher. So she would take these jobs across the country. She taught at Columbia College in South Carolina, she taught at the University of Virginia, and she taught at West Texas State Normal College in Canyon. And I think those locations were really key to this breakthrough moment where she was really developing her visual language. As we'll see, she was in correspondence with friends in New York. She was hearing about things that were happening in New York. She was being sent journals and books, and she was really reading Kandinsky's On the Spiritual and Art. She was very well versed, but she also had space and distance from the centers of the art world in order to explore her own language. She said, I have shapes in my head that are not like what anyone taught me. So she may have learned plenty of things in her academic training, but it was these shapes in her head that were beyond her training that lead her here. And she says in 1915, I decided to start anew, to strip away what I had been taught, to accept as true my own thinking. So we have that balance between what she's kind of coming into things with and what she's producing. And so I'm just showing you two of these really early breakthrough charcoals that are in the exhibition. The one on the left I'll point out in particular, you can see that the title invokes the idea of music. This is really common for artists who are interested in abstraction in the beginning decades of the 20th century. Music, of course, is an art form that's already released from the obligations of a figure. So it's already there. It's already in an abstract place. It already isn't depending on representation. And so those ideas of rhythm or tone or harmony or counterpoint are all part of her thinking in kind of juxtaposing a very wide range of marks in a charcoal like this. And then on the right, I'll point to this beautiful charcoal in the Manils collection, which she describes as a drawing of a headache. And I love that because it's funny and relatable. We've all been there, but it also points to her goals, right? It's not purely abstract. It's not purely divorced from an experience of real life. It's also not purely representational. She's not drawing a picture of herself having a headache. She's having a physical sensation or experience, and she's seeking to transfer or translate that experience into drawing, and that's how we get this really beautiful drawing of a headache. And as the apocryphal story goes, she's rolling up many of these drawings that she's making in 1915, 1916, something that would make our conservators have a heart attack today. She's sending them in the mail to her friend Anita Pulitzer in New York, whom she met at Teachers College, Columbia, and they're corresponding about what they think of the work. And apocryphally, on January 1st, 1916, Anita Pulitzer rolls up some of George's drawings under her arm, brings them to Alfred Stieglitz's gallery 291, shows the drawings to this much older, more famous gallerist and photographer who declares at last a woman on paper. And he includes 3 of the drawings in an exhibition in 1916 and then gives O'Keeffe an exhibition of her own in 1917. And this launches a correspondence that will then lead to a great love affair, later a marriage, all kinds of other things. I wanted to point out too, while we're kind of on the subject here of pedagogy and teaching and training, that I think it's really important and an important piece of this serial practice that O'Keeffe herself was a teacher. That at the same time that she's making these breakthrough works on paper, she's teaching during the day. So she's making the drawings at night, often on the floor, using the full weight of her body to kind of press into these large sheets of a very very nice laid paper. But during the day, she's in the classroom, and she writes to her friend Pulitzer in New York to send her reproductions from the Met that she can hang on her classroom walls, to send her books she can use in her classroom. And these are some samples of her students' work. And I just love the idea that rehearsal or repetition or seriality is inherent to education, to art education, and to learning, and to practicing, and to investigating. And so I think that the idea that she's in the classroom doing that with her students all day would not have been lost on her, consciously or otherwise, in making her own work at night. So here we are at that first wall that you see when you enter the exhibition, and this is this series of which will eventually be called Blue Lines for the third version. This is the first time that all three of these works, which comprise the entire series, are on view together ever. There are a number of instances like that in the show, which are really, really exciting. Not only because it's a kind of a coup to kind of bring the works together, but because of what we can learn from seeing works together about an artist's process. So often we focus on the kind of individual masterpiece or single work, and really in particular, for O'Keeffe and for the works on paper, we learned so much about her process and her curiosity and her investigations by seeing how she's varying a composition from one work to the next. And I mentioned that her series are kind of ruled by different logics. And for me, the logic that you see right away in this series is one in which she's experimenting with materials. She's choosing a very similar composition. She's sticking with it, and she's pursuing it across three different materials. So we see her try it in charcoal, we see her try it in black watercolor, and we see her try it in blue watercolor until she says, sorry, I'm gonna just zoom in so you can see them a little better, till she gets to that one in blue, which she says feels right. And she'll later have a very strong identification with Blue Lines. She refers to it in a letter to Stieglitz as my blue self. So there's this kind of very close, almost personal connection with the drawing. He feels the same way about it. I'll mention he asks her multiple times if he can be cremated with it, which tells you a little something about him, that he'd rather the thing be incinerated than for us to be able to see it today. Luckily, it was not. But I love that she's really sticking with this composition, pursuing it across different materials, testing the effects of those materials until she feels happy in blue. And I think she really restricts her palette during this time to charcoal, and she says something like, I believe it was June until I needed blue. So she waits until she absolutely needs that next color or that next step materials-wise before she moves on. Traveling to, oops, I'm sorry. Okay, traveling to another pair in the exhibition, also from 1916, that's ruled by that same logic. Trying a composition in one medium, testing it again in a different medium, and you can see in these two works how very different the effect is, even much more different than it would have been across those very simplified blue lines. You get this really swirling vortex of a composition, which is one that recurs throughout her whole career and throughout the whole exhibition. So even as we have individual series where we have a composition repeating within a single series, you can also see motifs recurring across time in her work. And so these spirals will show up again and again throughout the career. But she tries this spiral in charcoal. She played the violin at the time, so some scholars think that it's a reference to the scroll of the violin, but of course it appears very abstract. And then she tries it in blue watercolor, and the effect is totally different. It's really luminous. You can see a lot of the white paper showing through the transparency of the medium. And so you can see her pursuing that across both. She'll say much later, decades later, she publishes a very beautiful book called Some Memories of Drawings, decades later, where she reflects on some of the work she's made much earlier. And she says about this drawing from the Whitney, I have made this drawing several times. And so this idea of seriality or repetition is one of which she's very conscious, that she's self-conscious about in the best way. So we'll move next to this series of 4 works that are in the collection of the Brooklyn Museum. This is one of the few series in the exhibition where all works in the series belong to a single lender, which is great for a curator. All the others we had to kind of assemble piecemeal, which is its own kind of challenge. But I love how these works show, you see that she arrived at that blue that she loved, and then she's really delving into the blue more seriously, but I love how the kind of logic of this series now brings us somewhere else. Why is she making a series now? Well, rather than changing the medium, she's sticking now with the same medium and shifting the composition, right? So she starts with the most complex and she reduces to the most simple. I think a lot of us, when we think of a series, might think of it mounting in intensity as we move along, becoming more complex along the way. But in fact, this is a process of reduction and of simplification. And I love that these works kind of show that happening from the first to the last. I don't know if it's visible on this slide. I think it is actually in these images, but these are also made on a very thin Japanese rice paper called gampi. And you can see that there are some wrinkles on the paper itself, and she was so intentional and particular about her material choices. She knew that if she tried different papers or different materials, the effects would be different, and so that wrinkling would have occurred at the moment that her wet brush touched that really thin tissue paper. People have asked me if it was damage that happened along the way, but in fact, no. And so we have so many of her letters, which is an incredible resource. The bulk of them live at the Beinecke Library at Yale University. A large volume of her letters with Alfred Stieglitz was published in 2008 or 2009 by the wonderful curator Sarah Greeno, who's a photography curator at the NGA Washington. I highly recommend it. It's like really fun reading in addition to being incredibly illuminating. And there are also published letters between her and this Teachers College classmate that I mentioned, Anita Politzer. And these are a selection of them. And what I love about these, if you can just recall the compositions, oops, I'm sorry. If you can recall the compositions that we just looked at, you'll recognize those little doodles on the letter. And I love what this tells us, which is that these works were so abstract, there was no way to describe them. So when she's rolling them up and sending them in the mail to her friend, on the left is the letter from Anita to Georgia saying, this one is very beautiful. And rather, she can't say, oh, the green landscape or the painting of the rabbit is very beautiful. She has to draw it because it's ineffable. There's no way to describe this really reduced and radical composition. And then you see O'Keeffe's letter in response where she confirms which one she's talking about with her own drawings. So I love that we get the artist herself essentializing her composition, which is already a reduced composition, even more into these little figures in her letters. So we'll shift to Texas now. This is now another one of these teaching jobs in Canyon, Texas. And the city of Canyon, Texas is named for its dominant geological feature, which is the Palo Duro Canyon. And the logic of this series, she talks about visiting the canyon and kind of dipping into the slopes and feeling small amidst this big landscape. And what I found to be really helpful in terms of understanding the logic of this series was a concept borrowed from the scholar Lisa Volpe, who has just organized in multiple venues a really beautiful show of O'Keeffe's photography. So she refers to this logic as one of reframing. It's really almost a photographic logic. And you can see O'Keeffe trying these compositions that relate to the canyon in multiple ways. She makes a series of these very small sketches, really tiny, and that are more recognizable and realistic as being a landscape. And then she, again, reduces. She kind of sloughs away anything unnecessary, and she tries it in multiple ways. She tries it as a vertical, she tries it as a horizontal, she tries it in color, she tries it not in color. She zooms in on an individual particular feature and lets everything else drop away until you get a composition that feels really abstract. And if you saw that one, you might not know what it would refer to or that it would refer to anything. And that's okay with her. She calls it an abstraction. But if you know that she was prancing around Palo Duro Canyon in 1916, 1917, you can relate those forms back to the scrubby cedar trees that she sees in the canyon. So that brings us to Evening Star. This is in many ways the highlight of the exhibition. This is a series of 8 watercolors that she made in Texas in 1917, and this is the first time ever that all 8 watercolors in this series are together. So this really is a kind of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to see this series in process. And her palette has expanded. She started with charcoal, she went to blue, we see a little bit of color sneaking in, and then when she gets to Texas, the sky opens up, and the palette of the Texas sky demands an expanded palette in her watercolor practice. And you can see how she starts with an almost proto-Rothko bleed, an almost purely abstract kind of layering of color, and then she pulls out of that kind of blur these individual bands of color that start to represent the sunset. The third in the series is the one in MoMA's collection, maybe the most graphic, and then you see her trying different things. She drops in green in the sky, she drops in blue. What happens if I try a red sky? What happens if I really bleed and blur it so that the individual bands start to disappear and become really diffuse? And then we get to the last iteration, which is in Yale's collection. And in addition to being slightly bigger than all of the others, it is on a different kind of paper. And this would have been really intentional. This again goes to her intentionality with materials. She was seeking this diffuse effect that mimics the experience of a sunset, and she realized she couldn't achieve it on these sheets of smooth wove paper, and so she adopts instead a long fiber Japanese paper that would absorb the watercolor differently, that would really soak it in and create that effect to mimic the sunset. And so the logic of this series, of course, is yet another one, a sense of duration, right? This is a natural phenomenon occurring over time, and how could you possibly represent the arc or the experience of a sunset in a single image? You need 8 sheets, maybe, to do that. So here you see the evening stars installed in the exhibition, and right across from them you see this series of self-portrait nudes that she made simultaneously. In her letters to Stieglitz, she's talking about that she's making these nudes at the same time that she's making these sunsets, and she is conscious of that relationship. She talks about the nudes as giving her a feeling of bigness, like the red landscape. I hope you can get a sense just from my snippets of her voice, of how distinctive her voice is in writing as well as visually. And so these are some images of some of those nudes, and they're so free and frank. She would have seen, when she was a student at the Art Students League in 1908, an exhibition of Rodin's watercolors of nudes at Stieglitz's Gallery 291, which at that moment she dismissed as just a lot of scribbles. But we know she's looking back at reproductions of them in Stieglitz's journals later. And she writes to Stieglitz about the process of making these. She says, "It never occurred to me to paint myself naked. It was so much fun." And I love that we have that sense of fun from the artist, and I think you see that in the materiality of these works, how free and loose they are. She's clearly thinking of Rodin, but she also says there's something about woman that only woman can explore, and I think that kind of self-looking is really important here. I think these are really surprising for people. After they were shown in 1923, they weren't exhibited for decades and decades, and I think we can attribute that to the kind of misconceived, over-sexualized readings of her work that Stieglitz himself promoted, knowing that would be good for business, but I think it would have been too risky to kind of lean into those misreadings with work as sort of frank and pleasurable as this. But I sort of hope and believe that today we can kind of take these for what they are. And I also like to note back to that moment that I sort of asked you to keep in your minds of her kind of being a model for Spyker or being an artist for herself. In these works, she's both artist and model, right? And so she talks in those letters to Stieglitz about catching herself in a certain twist or an awkward pose or changing her position. And I love how in this particular watercolor, she's in the same position in which we see her working in watercolor in a photograph that Stieglitz took of her in 1918. So this is her position, this is her working position as much as her modeling position. I'll note too, this is the only image of her I've included in the exhibition very intentionally. I think she's an artist whose kind of iconicity we're extremely familiar with, and the intricacies of her work less so. So I'm trying to recalibrate that balance a bit in the show. Those are nude self-portraits. These, believe it or not, as you can see from the titles, are portraits. They're abstract portraits of the photographer Paul Strand. And she says about them, "Some people make me see shapes, others don't. I was trying to tell myself why." So if we begin to try to search them for a profile or anything like that, we're going down the wrong road. Just as she's trying to make a drawing of a headache and express what that experience might be, these watercolors try to express the experience to her of Paul Strand. An artist not known for her portraits. We've seen now nude self-portraits, we'll see these, and we'll see another series of portraits in a much more realistic vein to come. I did want to point out too, I keep mentioning her intentionality with materials. It was important to us to foreground that by including her materials themselves in the exhibition. So we have this case of goodies from the O'Keeffe Museum in Santa Fe. You can see some of the range of her materials. And in particular, I'll point out that you can see in this box there, manufactured pastels with their labels on them. There are French and German brands. And in that wooden box, you can see pastels she would have made herself. She was so curious about materials and so invested in their outcomes that she would try different recipes and produce her own pastels to work as well. I mentioned she studied at Teachers College Columbia in addition to the Art Students League, and it's interesting in her letters with Anita Pulitzer, we get a sense of these two sites as an interesting conversation for these kind of young artists studying in New York at the time. And if Chase maybe ruled the league at that point with his kind of flamboyant personality, Arthur Wesley Dow was the kind of luminary teacher from Teachers College, and he published a primer called Composition, which was an incredibly important resource for O'Keeffe and for many artists, and he stressed the idea of testing and varying different compositions along the way. And so this is a page from that book, Composition, which was republished in many iterations along the way, but I found it really interesting to think about in light of that pair of watercolors that are in the exhibition. And you can see her kind of, reducing the number of trees, the moon is down, the moon is up, so we have a sense of duration like we might have had in the Evening Star series, but we also have her testing and varying the composition in a way that Dow would have suggested. Anita Pulitzer, I should mention, continues to study at the League for much longer than O'Keeffe did, and in their letters, you get really interesting snippets of the League's history from Anita's point of view. So less particular to our understanding of Georgia, but we do hear from Anita how she's taking George Bridgman's life drawing class and really enjoying it, but often complaining about her mechanical drawing class, which was taught by Frank Panuska, which maybe means more to you than it did to me when I read it, but Anita informs Georgia, "I spent 2 hours ruling a line in fractions of inches and cutting up triangles." And so she's a little bit exasperated with this process of mechanical drawing. And so we are now in 1918, and if you visit the exhibition, we're now at a moment where you've kind of exited the first half of the exhibition and entered the second half, and that happens only 2 or 3 years into where the exhibition starts. So she made as many works on paper in those breakthrough years of 1915 to 17 or 18 as she would the whole rest of her life, which was a long one, because in 1918, Stieglitz invites her to New York, or back to New York, and agrees to support her as a painter. She didn't yet have the kind of leisure or support to be a painter, and he provides that, and so she does lean into oil. And so on the right, you'll see one of her very beautiful oil paintings from 1918, Music, Pink and Blue, #1. And on the left, you'll see a pastel along with it. And so at this moment when she's shifting to her practice on canvas, she leans away from her work on paper a bit, but she does interestingly take up pastel. And she understands pastel to be a kind of a corollary to oil paint. It helps her figure things out with the same color harmonies and the same matte texture that she would explore in oil paint. She says she likes pastels because she can move more quickly. She likes oils because they're more definite. So you can see her working with a new kind of relationship between two different mediums. I love this pair of charcoals in the exhibition because they remind us how much she was a New Yorker. Of course, she's an artist we often associate with her time in New Mexico, which comes later. But she lived not very far from here at the Shelton Hotel on Lexington Avenue between 48th and 49th Streets. And she had a kind of a bird's eye view from her upper floor apartments of the growing city. And so you can see how she renders the urban landscape almost as if it's in a kind of a fog or a haze. She goes to Lake George. Senya mentioned that she won the league's scholarship to a summer program up at Lake George, and that would be a kind of fortuitous connection later when she visits Stieglitz's family compound in Lake George. I have to say she was not a fan of Lake George. She found the palette to be all greens and browns, and you can see that in the two pastels, which I have to say are very beautiful despite her distaste for the landscape. Here, and again, you see that spiral form we talked about at the beginning recurring, but the Stieglitz family was a kind of a very social and large family, and she wanted to be left alone to do her work. So she needed a retreat from the retreat. In 1922, she goes to York Beach in Maine, and you start to see these very beautiful oceanscapes that she makes in pastel. And she talks about working the pastel so vigorously that she's wearing down the skin from her fingers in making them and producing these really smoothly gradated passages. She stops at the MFA Boston on her way up to Maine, and it's interesting to note what she sees there and what she likes seeing. So again, that importance of artists also looking at other artists' work. She talks about seeing some Millet pastels, so we know that pastel is on her mind. She talks about seeing a row of Monets. We know that seriality or a row of works is on her mind. She talks about being very taken with the Chinese and Japanese things on view. And it's my unproven theory that the kind of very unusual Tondo shape of this pastel is indebted to a fan painting that she would have seen in 1922 at the MFA Boston. But she writes in her letters about this storm breaking out, and when I first saw these two pastels, I thought they were so bizarre. I couldn't really figure them out. They seemed really uncharacteristic. And when you read her letters describing that storm, they become completely self-evident, and I just completely fell for them. On the left, we do have some flowers in the exhibition, I promise. But of course, we're leaning a little bit away from the iconic motifs in order to show a different side of this artist. And she doesn't make as many flowers on paper as she would on canvas. But she does in 1933 go to Bermuda. She has a little bit of a breakdown, honestly, and she stops working and she goes to Bermuda to recuperate and starts slowly to draw again. And I think very poetically, it's this subject of the banana flower slowly unfolding again and blossoming that brings her back to work. This is a beautiful orchid pastel from MoMA's collection from 1943. And then I sort of teased that we would see another series of portraits. We saw her nude self-portraits, we saw the abstract portraits of Paul Strand. And when you come around a wall in the exhibition, you are confronted with this series of portraits, which I think come as something of a surprise for a number of reasons. The fact that she's working in portraiture at all, when this is not a genre for which this artist is known, the fact that she's working in such a realistic vein. She would only make 2 series of realistic portraits, these and a pair that represents Stieglitz's niece, but this subject is much more illustrious than that. This is the artist Beaufort Delaney. And that's another reason why I find them surprising and so compelling, is that we tend as art historians often to put artists in little boxes. O'Keeffe is a modernist from the 20s. Delaney was an artist associated with abstract expressionism who then moved to Paris, and never the twain shall meet. But in fact, the twain did meet. Delaney liked to visit Stieglitz's galleries in New York, and he suggested that he sit for her. And we know from their correspondence that she said, "I don't like to ask people to sit for me," because she herself was the subject of so many portraits and knew how taxing that could be. "But since you suggest, maybe we will give it a try. I warn you, however, I'm slow going." And that slowness, I think, is what we see in the series that results. Both the care in each individual portrait, but the fact that she made multiple portraits. And to me, this relates back to The Evening Star. Just as we can't think about capturing a sunset in a single image, how can you begin to express the complexity of a human being in a single image? Maybe you need 4 or 5. It also relates back to the quote from which the title of the exhibition is taken. She said, "Nobody sees a flower, really. We haven't time. And to see takes time, like to have a friend takes time." So I like the idea that she's taking time with these drawings in this series, just as she's taking time in kind of getting to know Beaufort Delaney. Of course, an artist who's known for his portraits more than she is for hers. So we have this irony of an artist not known for her portraits making portraits of an artist known for his portraits. And there he is, there's a close-up of one of them, and there he is in his studio with some of his portraits, including one of his famous paintings of his friend, the writer James Baldwin, just above him. I mentioned, of course, New Mexico as a site with which we associate O'Keeffe. She began going there in summers in 1929, and she moves there full-time in 1949 after Stieglitz dies in 46, and she takes a few years to settle his estate. And this is where we see these kind of motifs of horns and bones, the rectangles of her patio door, of her Abiquiu home, and this is a photograph she took of that door and 2 drawings she made of that door. And she said she bought the house because of that door, that the door haunted her and that she needed to represent it again and again. And I love that it's both representational and abstract. It's a rectangle, it's as flat as can be, and of course it's also referring to something very real in her experience. Finally, the last series in the exhibition is one that she makes in 1959. After Stieglitz was a little bit of a curmudgeon, he didn't like to travel beyond, he never went to New Mexico to visit her, and he didn't like to go beyond that kind of New York, Lake George circuit. So after he's gone, she spreads her wings and has some more adventures. And in 1959, she takes a 3-month trip around the world. She goes to India, she goes to Japan, and she makes these tiny sketches of the landscape seen from the airplane window. And you can see that they're on the stationery from the hotels that she's staying at along the way. This is the Hotel Raffles Singapore. They've imprinted her name on her stationery, but they've misspelled it. As we New Yorkers know, people are wont to do, as was done recently in the LIRR station at Grand Central. Her name was misspelled in stone, no less. But I digress. She makes these tiny sketches, and really for a moment, hold these compositions in your mind, because they will become these larger charcoals and paintings. And she shows these in 1961 in New York. She begins to show with the gallerist Edith Halpert at Downtown Gallery after Stieglitz dies and no longer represents her. Maybe some of you saw that great exhibition about Halpert at the Jewish Museum a few years ago. But these paintings are shown, and she tells an interviewer in 1961, they may seem abstract, but they are what I saw and very realistic to me. And I think that that relationship between observing forms in the world, presenting them as if abstractions, but them always being tied to something referential is a real kind of subtle and complex dynamic in her work, and maybe the key to understanding her approach that I think is often missed. And so these are works from 1959. The paintings go as late as 1964. And so you can think about works like this being shown in the 60s alongside things like Kenneth Noland or Barnett Newman or Ellsworth Kelly, and really having a kind of a resonance, and I think feeling really fresh today. The charcoal that you see on the right is actually one in MoMA's collection, and I actually hung that drawing in a smaller collection exhibition a few years ago about post-war drawing that I made called Degree Zero. And it was by hanging that drawing in that show that I came to this project. When I would take people through that show, they would say, "That's a Georgia O'Keeffe?" And it so didn't conform to our understanding of this artist that I found that really exciting. Dug in, learned that this was part of a series, learned that all the drawings in MoMA's collection were part of a series, and went down this road. And I mentioned too that in addition to those individual series having relationships to each other, there's this sense of recurrence across time. And so I'll just bring us back to that original pair of 2 lines, just really remarking from the beginning of her career to much later in her career, how much those kind of central forms guided her practice and really lent her work a radicality for which I think it's often not recognized. So thank you so much. I want to leave time for questions.